If you're a runner, then there's a chance that you've heard of the term VO2 Max. Now, we love it, we think it's important to know what it is, and it's definitely irregular in a lot of runners' search histories. And don't worry, if you're not a runner, don't worry either, because we're going to tell you everything you need to know about it so you can become an expert too. Simply put, VO2 Max is the amount of oxygen that your body can utilise per kilogram of body weight per minute. Now, if you're still confused, then ultimately we all breathe the same air, and we're looking at a measure of how effectively we can use the components of that air for exercise. So when we're taking on high intensity sport, maybe that could be running, then we're trying to transport oxygen that we've taken in from the air through our body to the muscles and tissues, and it's the hemoglobin in our red blood cells that allows us to do that. A higher VO2 max figure means that we're going to be able to exercise for longer at a particular intensity, or we might find exercise generally easier. So that singular VO2 max figure, that number, ultimately it's one way of measuring your capacity for endurance exercise. Okay, let's head out and explain a little bit more. Okay, so I'm out on a run to tell you ultimately why, as runners, I think that you should care about VO2 Max. Why is it relevant? Well, if you're anything like me or anyone else at the Running Channel team, then regardless of your goals, then you're a little bit competitive, even if that competition is just with yourself, because measuring your progress over time can be a really good way to stay motivated. So having a single number that allows you to kind of boil your endurance or aerobic fitness down to that one number and track it over the long term could be a really good way of staying motivated. So what should your VO2 max be? What could it be? And how much could you improve it? Well, there's no clear answer, but there obviously is a lot of research into averages for the population. In fact, we'll pop a table up on screen which gives you some examples, and they vary by gender and by age as well. At the bottom end, if you're fairly sedentary and don't do any activity, then you might find a VO2 max between 27 and 30 for women and 35 and 40 for men. Then at the top end, we're talking 70 plus for elite women and maybe even 80 plus for elite men. As an example, my VO2 max now, age 40, is about 60, 62, whereas when I first started out in my career as a professional, it was about 68 as a very well-trained athlete, but I managed to get it up to 80 over the course of 4 or 5 years, really consistent training. So you can make a really significant impact on your VO2 max and overall fitness just through the right training. But surely the one thing that I haven't talked about is clout. Having a number that objectively measures how fit you are, surely that's something you should shout about. Set it as your profile picture, get it in those group chats. No, don't do that. I mean, you'll get kicked out of those group chats, probably a little bit boring and a bit of a show off, but the point I'm making is that VO2 max is actually an individual figure that you should use to benchmark yourself against time as you hopefully see progress. Bearing in mind that, of course, as you get a little bit older, or if you have time away from the sport, that will dip. It's an objective measure for you to see where you're at against where you were previously, rather than for you to compare yourself against other people. So we know what VO2 max is and why we should care about it, but how do you actually go about measuring it? Well, ultimately there are two key ways. The first of which is the hardest and definitely going to put you through the most pain and trouble. In fact, if you want to check out what it's like to test your VO2 max in a lab, which is what I'm talking about, then head here to see exactly what happened when Sarah and I did just that. But if you don't want to end up like this, then the other opportunity for you is to use your watch if you have a smartwatch. Now, a lot of smartwatches will give you a measure of VO2 max provided that you've done enough specific types of activities on the watch already, so that it has enough data to make that estimate for you. But don't worry, you might be thinking, how accurate are those smartwatches? Well, in fact, the video that we just talked about where we went to the lab was to find out exactly that, and it turned out pretty accurate, or certainly accurate enough for you to use them as a measure of your own fitness. So that way is definitely much easier. Before I tell you how to go about improving your VO2 max with some specific examples, if you found this video interesting or useful, in fact, even if you haven't, please just be nice and like the video and subscribe to the Running Channel too. Then you'll be in with a chance of winning a brand new Garmin smartwatch, which will help you to measure your VO2 max. If you don't know what to comment, then comment either your VO2 max score if you know it, or your favorite types of workouts to go about improving your endurance. And if we get to more than 3,000 likes, then one of those smartwatches could be yours. So how do you actually go about improving your VO2 max? Well, by doing lots of running, that's the most obvious way. And ultimately, a varied training week is the best way to get fitter. So that's throwing in slower, long runs, threshold runs. But if we're looking for the maximum bang for your buck in terms of improving your VO2 max, then what we're talking about is interval training. And some interval training will have a bigger impact than others. Ultimately, what we're talking about as the most important thing is having a sustained high average heart rate over a period of time. So running at effort that is close to, so just below, just above, or right at your VO2 max pace. And to find that VO2 max pace, then roughly it's the effort you could run all out at for between 5 and 10 minutes. So for more experienced runners, that might be their 2K or 2 mile pace. But for most runners, it's probably right around their 1 mile pace. You're looking to try to strike a balance between how long your hard efforts are and then how long the recoveries are, because you need to keep your heart rate high enough. So if you're talking about really short efforts of maybe 30 or 60 seconds, then actually you're gonna have to keep the recovery really short to make sure your heart rate doesn't drop too much in the recovery. It's also important to keep jogging the whole time, so even in recoveries, you're gonna keep moving. So think about doing 30 seconds hard, 30 seconds easy recovery where you're still moving. And because we're aiming to keep our heart rate high for a certain amount of time, aiming for between 15 and 20 minutes, you're gonna need to do 15 lots of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, or maybe 10 to 12 lots of 60 seconds on, and then somewhere between 30, 45, maybe 60 seconds recovery for that one. Now, what I think of as the more traditional VO2 max workouts tend to use intervals between 2 and 3 minutes in duration, and then have recoveries of a similar duration. Now, we're looking for that overall hard effort of 20 minutes in this case. So these sessions are going to be slightly longer overall, but you could start, if you've never done this before, with something like 4 times 2 minutes, then look to build up to that 20-minute volume. So 6 times 3 minutes is about 18 minutes, 8 to 10 times 2 minutes would also be about right. But definitely, because they're slightly longer, factor these types of workouts into your overall week in terms of your overall mileage. You could also choose to take the emphasis away from pace altogether by doing the same sort of duration of intervals, think 2 minutes, but on a tough hill. Now, don't pick too steep a hill, because you still need to be able to run at that sustained intensity for 2 minutes. You want to make it achievable. Make sure you jog back down and then repeat. I'm just coming to the end of my run here, and that's an important point. We're talking about sustaining a high heart rate, high average heart rate for that 15 to 20 minute duration to have the maximum impact on your VO2 max. That doesn't always have to be running. In fact, something that's equally well suited to that is HIIT training, so high intensity interval training. So it doesn't always have to be running. You could throw something else in the mix. And we always say that cross training definitely helps with your running anyway. So now that you know everything, hopefully, there is to know about VO2 max, you should head here to check this video out, all about threshold running, which I think could be the missing piece of your running jigsaw to complement all of the stuff we've talked about in this video.